Chapter 6 on learning. This is one of my favorite chapters, and that's because this is what I have my degree in. I got my PhD from Kansas State University in animal learning and behavior, experimental psychology. And so I love this chapter. A lot of students, not so much. And I think that's only because the terminology is something a little bit odd for them. It's not what they're used to speaking in a everyday life. But I can guarantee you that the information in this chapter is 100% applicable to your everyday life. I'm sure you have used classical conditioning and operant conditioning in your life, and we're not even aware of it. So I think you'll really like this chapter. There are, I think, 3 modules in this chapter. Hopefully I'm not wrong on that. But we are going to start out with Module 17. Okay, so Module 17, Classical Conditioning. In Module 18, we'll start talking about operant conditioning. And then I think in Module 19, we will talk about social learning types of things, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But first off, Module 17, Classical Conditioning. There are 2 questions we are going to answer in this chapter. The first question is, of course, what is learning? If I were to ask you, what is learning, it may be a little bit difficult to define learning. I think we all know what learning is, but to actually define it is a little bit difficult. The second question we have is, how do we learn to form associations between stimuli and those responses? And that is exactly what classical conditioning is. There is some sort of stimulus and then a response that comes from that stimulus. So those are the 2 questions that we're going to answer in this module. The first thing I want to discuss before I get into the historical aspect of classical conditioning is I want to talk about this term habituation. We mentioned this previously in a previous chapter, but habituation, you think about the word habit, right? A habit is something that you continually keep doing, sometimes without even being aware of it. Habituation is very similar. When we think about learning, it's kind of like a habit. You do something over and over again, and the learning becomes very easy. It becomes habitual. So for learning, it's a relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by an experience. It's not always easy to identify whether a change in behavior is due to nature or to nurture. And we say this because we would like to think that it's due because of nurture, the way that we are raised. However, infants exhibit a very simple type of learning called habituation. Habituation itself is the decrease in a response to a stimulus that occurs after you've been repeatedly presented to that same stimulus. And that is how infants learn. Not necessarily by me telling them something, but because they figure it out on their own. However, most learning is a lot more complex than that. The various types of learning that we're going to discuss in this first module with classical conditioning, you'll see that it's a lot more complex as far as what goes into it. So let's start out with the basics of classical conditioning. So we're going to take a little historical walk here. And we're going to go back to the historical study by Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov's classic experiment on basic learning showed that dogs who salivated in response to food would begin to salivate just as the approach of the experimenter who normally brought the food. So what happened is Pavlov had nothing to do with psychology. He was a physicist, and he was doing research looking at digestion. And so in his study, he used dogs as his experimental subjects, and he wanted to look at their saliva. he wanted to collect their saliva. I shouldn't say he wanted to look at their saliva, but he wanted to see how much they salivated. And so he would feed the dogs a certain, he called it like a meat powder, like a dog food. And the dogs would salivate. And Pavlov had a tube that left the dog's cheek. It was inserted into their cheek, and it left their cheek and went into like a glass jar. And so as the dogs salivated to this food that they were eating, the saliva would be collected and he could measure how much the dogs were salivating. And this all went into his study on digestion. Again, nothing at all to do with psychology. What Pavlov found out is that every day he went through the same routine. He would come into the lab, he would get the dogs out of their cages, he would harness them, he would insert the tube, and he would give them this meat powder, and then he would collect their saliva. So that was the same thing that he did every day. What he started to realize is that sometimes as soon as he walked into the lab, the dogs would start salivating. He had not even taken them out of their crates yet, and they started salivating. So they had no food whatsoever in their mouths, yet they were salivating. And he found that very interesting. And so he started to research this, why the dogs were salivating. And he figured out that the dogs were anticipating getting fed. The dogs had learned that each day there was a sequence of events that occurred which led eventually to food. And so as soon as the dogs saw Pavlov, they would start to salivate. So the dogs were responding as a result of learning. Originally, they were responding as a result of having the meat powder for them to eat, but then they started to respond as a result of learning, knowing the sequence of events and that they were going to get fed. And this came about to be known as classical conditioning. Ironically, Pavlov went on to win the Nobel Prize in Science that year because of his findings, and it wasn't even originally what he intended to find. So it's accidental what he found, and he got the Nobel Prize for it. That hardly ever happens, but it did happen for Pavlov. So if we want to define classical conditioning, it is a type of learning where you have a neutral stimulus that comes about to elicit a response after that neutral stimulus is paired with a stimulus that naturally brought about the response. So you have this stimulus that naturally brings about a response. It causes a reflex. With reflexes, there is no learning involved. Okay? It just automatically happens. So you have this stimulus that causes a reflexive response. When you take a neutral stimulus and pair it with that natural stimulus, now the neutral stimulus will bring about the same reflexive response. Because you have learned, you are anticipating what is going to happen. So I want to spend some time defining these terms that I keep using: natural stimulus, neutral stimulus, things like that. So let's do some basic definitions and get those out of the way. First off, we have the neutral stimulus. This is any stimulus that before conditioning occurs, it does not naturally bring about a response. Does not naturally bring about a response. It's neutral. You also have the unconditioned stimulus, or we abbreviated UCS. This is the natural stimulus. This is the stimulus that will bring about that reflexive response, right? There is no learning that occurs. Stimulus, response automatically happens. That reflexive response is called the unconditioned response, or we abbreviate it UCR. So it is natural and it needs no training. It is a reflex. So you have the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. This is where students mess up the most. The unconditioned stimulus has always got to lead to an unconditioned response. If you think about conditioning and learning, meaning the same thing, they are synonymous with each other, the unconditioned stimulus is the unlearned stimulus. The unconditioned response is the unlearned response. It just automatically occurs. Next, we have what is called the conditioned stimulus, or it is abbreviated CS. So again, if conditioning and learning mean the same thing, the conditioned stimulus is the learned stimulus. It was, at one point in time, the neutral stimulus. However, because it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus, it now will bring about the same response. So the conditioned stimulus brings about a response formerly caused only by the unconditioned stimulus. Now, if you remember from the previous slide, the unconditioned stimulus brought about the unconditioned response. The conditioned stimulus brings about a conditioned response, and it is abbreviated CR. The conditioned response is a response after conditioning follows that neutral stimulus. And a lot of times these are the unconditioned response and the conditioned response may be the exact same response. However, they are in response to two different stimuli, and that's what you have to keep in mind. They may seem the exact same, but they are in response to two different stimuli. Now, this slide you can find on page 172 in your textbook, and this is exactly what Pavlov did. So before conditioning, right, you have a neutral stimulus, the sound of a bell, and the dog does nothing. He may prick up his ears because it's a noise, but he's surely not going to salivate to a bell. If you go around salivating to bells, that's a whole other diagnosis that we'll talk about in chapter 15 and 16. But we normally do not salivate to bells. However, if you put meat powder down, the dog is going to salivate, right? You give the dog meat and he's going to salivate. So in Pavlov's study, that meat was the unconditioned stimulus that brought about this reflex of salivation, which is the unconditioned response. And that's what this says in letter A. Before conditioning, the sound of a bell does not produce salivation, meaning that the bell is a neutral stimulus. In contrast, meat naturally does bring about salivation, making the meat an unconditioned stimulus and the salivation an unconditioned response. Now, if you look at during conditioning, right, here we are in the center block. You have the sound of the bell that's paired with the meat. Sound of bell, meat, sound of bell, meat, sound of bell, meat, and then salivation, right? Bell meets salivation, bell meets salivation, bell meets salivation. So during conditioning, the bell rings just before the meat is presented. Now, if you look down to letter C, after conditioning, because that bell was consistently paired with the meat, now as soon as the dog hears the bell, it's going to start salivating. So eventually the sound of the bell alone produces salivation. We now can say that conditioning has been accomplished. The dog has learned something. The previously neutral stimulus of the bell is now considered a conditioned stimulus, and it brings about a conditioned response. Remember, up here in the very beginning of letter A, the sound of the bell, the dog didn't salivate. He only salivated when he got the meat powder. But now you're pairing the bell with the meat powder, and eventually the dog will salivate to the bell alone. And this is exactly what happened in Pavlov's study. So let's do a brief summary of what we just learned about classical conditioning. Conditioning and learning are synonymous with each other. They mean the same thing. Unconditioned means not learned. An unconditioned stimulus leads to an unconditioned response. Remember, these are reflexes. You do not have to learn about them. You are not trained. If you put a cookie in your mouth right now, you will start to salivate. It just automatically happens. You did not have to be trained to salivate. So in conditioning, a previously neutral stimulus is transformed into the conditioned stimulus. It used to be neutral, and now it's conditioned. You are learning about it. So the conditioned stimulus leads to a conditioned response. The conditioned response is the consequence of that learning. The unconditioned response and the conditioned response are similar. However, they are in response to two different things. Remember, the unconditioned response occurs naturally. It is a reflex. The conditioned response is not a reflex. So even though the conditioned response is salivation and the unconditioned response is salivation, they are salivation to two different stimuli. The unconditioned stimulus, or the unconditioned response, is in response to the meat powder. The conditioned response of salivation is in response to the bell. Now, so far, we have talked about classical conditioning with animals, right? Specifically, the dogs in Pavlov's study. However, definitely classical conditioning can be applied to human behavior. And this was first seen in a very well-known study done by Watson and his graduate student, Rayner. And it was a study about a little boy called Little Albert. It was a case study that they did with little Albert. So basically what they did is little Albert came into the lab each day. His mother volunteered him to take part in this study. He came into the lab each day, and Watson and Rayner put a little white rat in front of him, a live white rat. Now, little Albert was not afraid of this white rat. He was curious. He would kind of play with the white rat, but he was not at all afraid of the white rat. However, one day Watson and Rayner brought in the white rat and made this really loud sound right behind little Albert's head. Well, if you know anything about infants and children, when there's a loud noise, it scares them. And when they are scared, they start to cry. And so little Albert started to cry. The next day, Watson and Rayner bring in this white rat, and little Albert starts to cry. Remember, he was not previously afraid of the white rat. However, the loud noise was associated with the white rat, and now little Albert is afraid of the white rat. So the unconditioned stimulus was the loud noise. The unconditioned response was crying. It scared him. The conditioned stimulus was the white rat. And after the white rat was paired with the loud noise, Now the white rat alone brings about a conditioned response, which is crying. So Watson and Rayner showed that classical conditioning also can be applied to humans. And this produced conditioned fear. However, that study that was done was ethically questionable, and it would never be allowed to be done today. You just can't normally, scare little kids into making them cry. That would never be ethically allowed in today's world. However, it was allowed back then. And thank goodness, because it showed us that classical conditioning can also be applied to humans. So classical conditioning can lead to the development of various human aspects. One of those is phobias. A phobia is an intense, irrational fear, right? You may have a fear of heights. You may have a fear of flying. You may have a fear of spiders. You may have a fear of the number 13. All of these are irrational fears. However, to the person who has the fear, the phobia, it is quite intense for them. Classical conditioning can also lead to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And we'll talk about PTSD more in chapter 15. However, we know that a lot of servicemen and women who have suffered from some sort of wartime effect or behavior, that they've experienced PTSD. Something that would normally not make them afraid now does cause fear in them. Positive experiences, such as a song bringing back memories. A particular song that may not cause any emotional response whatsoever, when that song is paired, let's say, with an ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, now whenever you think of that song, all those memories come back of the time that you spent with that ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend. So we know that classical conditioning also helps explain why drug addiction is so difficult to treat. And your book talks a little bit about that, this drug addiction aspect with classical conditioning. It's something that I wish that more people understood the basics of classical conditioning, because it would help them understand drug addiction a lot better. Trying to see where this is, where it talks about it specifically in your book. On page 174, the very last paragraph before it gets into extinction. It's something that I encourage you to read, because I think it'll make a lot of sense. Okay, so let's get back to Pavlov and his salivating dogs. Once that Pavlov established classical conditioning, he wanted to know, how could I get the dogs to stop salivating? The salivating occurred because the bell was paired with the meat powder. What happens if I take away the meat powder? Will the dogs stop salivating? Well, what Pavlov found out is, yes, they will. And then what happens after that period of time when the dog stops salivating, if I then again bring back the meat powder? Will the dogs start salivating again? Yes, they will. So what Pavlov did is he established both extinction and spontaneous recovery. So extinction is when you take away the reinforcing stimulus. If you take away the meat powder, eventually the dog will stop responding to the bell. Now, after extinction has occurred, if one day you come back in a couple of days, couple of weeks later, and you present the bell again, the dogs may spontaneously salivate. However, here is the key. If you do not bring back the meat powder, the dogs will go right back into extinction again. The dogs are going to go back into extinction. And so this is what this figure is showing you. This is at the top of page 175, figure 2. Here you can see the training that has occurred, right? The conditioning. Then you have extinction. Then you wait a period of time. You present the bell again. If you don't present the meat powder, though, extinction is going to occur again. So you see the conditioning, the extinction, you bring back that CS. However, if there's no UCS, extinction is going to occur again. And it's really key also to notice that the spontaneous recovery response is not nearly as high as the original response was. So it's not going to go right back up there to where it was after classical conditioning. It will come back, but it won't be nearly as high as it was. Now, back to Pavlov's study again. Here we're going to talk about generalization and discrimination. When you generalize, you apply a concept to all different types of stimuli, right? You're generalizing. You get in an accident with an elderly person, and now you believe that all elderly people can't drive. That's generalizing, right? Discrimination is where you can tell the difference between two stimuli. You can discriminate between those two stimuli. This is also applied to classical conditioning. So stimulus generalization is a process in which after a stimulus has been conditioned to produce a particular response, stimuli that are similar produce the same response. So maybe you have a bell and a tone, right? And the dog is going to salivate to both the bell and the tone. It may never have heard the tone before, but it sounds very similar. So they're generalizing between those two stimuli. The greater the similarity between the two stimuli, the greater the likelihood of stimulus generalization occurring. However, if they are completely different, let's say a bell and a light, the dog can probably discriminate between those two and will only salivate to the bell. This is called stimulus discrimination. It's the process that occurs if two stimuli are sufficiently distinct from one another. One of those stimuli brings about the conditioned response, however, the other stimulus does not. So when you have stimulus discrimination, it provides this ability for you to differentiate between the two stimuli. All right, the very last thing that now I want to talk about in this module is let's go beyond traditionally what we thought about with classical conditioning. We want to challenge some of those basic assumptions. Really well-known learning psychologist is a guy by the name of John Garcia. And he found that some organisms are biologically prepared to avoid certain foods. And these foods are ones that smelled or tasted like something that previously made them sick. This is something that you probably have experienced before, and we call it taste aversion. So let's say that this happened to me one time. When I was little, we went to Hershey Park and we got on the swings, the swings that go around and around and around. Well, I had some grape flavored drink right before I got on the swings. As soon as I got off the swings, I threw up. And I threw up all of that grape flavored drink. Now, I could not stand anything that was grape flavored. It would make me extremely nauseous. I have overcome that now. Go wait for the ambulance to pass. I have overcome that now, but it took me a really long time. You may also have a conditioned taste aversion, right? That food originally did not make you sick. However, it was paired with being sick. And now you have a taste aversion to that. So this classical conditioning, or this conditioning, I shouldn't say classical, but this conditioning could occur even when the interval between exposure to the conditioned stimulus and the response was as long as 8 hours in between them. And that's something we usually did not find with classical conditioning. They had to occur close together in time in order for the association to be made between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. But learned taste aversions are completely different. We have found learned taste aversions to certain foods whenever the pairing has been an 8-hour time frame. The conditioning persisted over very long periods and sometimes occurred after just one exposure. Let's say that you are allergic to something. Let's say that you are allergic to shellfish, right? So the first time you have shellfish, maybe you had an allergic reaction to that, and it was a very bad allergic reaction. You had to be rushed to the emergency room, and you survived it. However, you know that you have a learned taste aversion now to shellfish. That's one trial learning. Usually we have one trial learning when it is something that could, go against our chances of survival. You may only have one chance to learn it. And that's what we also find with these learned taste aversions.